Happy holidays, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the Kickstarter Weekly. This week's episode is going to cover games that are funding between December 27th and January 2nd. And as has been true for a while now, it is a light Kickstarter offering during the holidays, and so there's only one currently running Kickstarter on the list. But before we get to that game, I'm going to talk about the 6 games that I've played since the last video. First up is Alma Mater, which is a Euro game. It's themed during the Renaissance around professors and universities and students, and it's by some of the same designers who worked on Barrage. Now, this is really a worker placement game, but it's a very tight game. And that's something that both my friend and I noticed when we did a 2-player game, which uses a third AI player, and my fiance when we did the same thing. So we noticed that, first of all, in that 2-player game, or in a 3-player game, locations are very tight. There are some spaces on the board that in a 2 or 3-player game have less locations than in the 4-player version, which uses the other side of the board. So it makes for a very tight game. And then when you're playing a 2-player version, you're also going to have a dummy AI player who's going to be blocking several spaces. Now, this game is a little bit more forgiving in that if you want to go to a space where someone else has already gone, you just need to pay more workers. So you could go to that space, but you're going to be paying 2 workers instead of 1 usually. And you can't go back there a second time. So if you've gone there once and you've spent 1 worker the first time, you cannot then go back and spend 2 workers and go again. But if another player's gone to that spot, you can also go there by spending more workers than they have. And it escalates. So if players of different colors are wanting to use the same spot, the first player is going to have to use 1 worker, the second player 2. If you're playing at higher player counts, the third player 3, the fourth player 4. And you only start the game with 4 workers. Throughout, you can pick up 2 more workers, which gives you a total of 6 workers. If you're playing with certain professors in the game, you may have the use of tutors. So you may be able to pick up a couple extra workers that way. But in general, you're only going to have between 4 and 6 workers around, which means spending 2 or more workers for an action is pretty prohibitive. So all of this is to say, we found the game very, very tight, and it's a game where you can't really do everything. You have to make choices and kind of decide which routes of scoring you're going to pursue in any given game. Now, I like games like that. I like games that make you have to make choices. However, in both of those games, I made hard choices, and I lost both of those games very miserably. So even though I enjoyed the games a lot, and I look forward to playing it again, and unfortunately there's no solo mode, so I cannot play it solo. I have to play with friends. And my fiance, Kristen, didn't really love it, so I'm looking to play with probably other friends of mine. This is a game that I personally enjoyed playing, and I'm excited to get back to the table again. So my rating with Alma Mater is sitting around an 8, 8.5. I think a lot of that's going to depend how well it plays at 4 players. And I've read online at Board Game Geek that is the ideal player count because it opens up the board a little bit. You don't have a dummy AI player like you do in 2-player. You don't have a super congested board like the way you do in 3-player. So it gives everyone a little more breathing room and the ability to hopefully score points through a variety of mechanisms, which is already hard anyway. So when the board opens up at 4 players, I think it's going to make the game a little more pleasurable, and that will be the sweet spot. But I have not yet played it at 4 players. Now, the game is set in Renaissance Italy, and you are essentially a startup of a new college, a new university, and you're going to the big university where all the best teachers teach, where all the best students attend. There are also kind of graduate students that can help, and you are trying to hire those professors and teachers to come join you at your university. Some of those worker placement spots will allow you to recruit students or to hire professors, but in both cases, you're going to need a lot of money and a lot of books of all different colors. And books are divided by player color for the most part. So other than 1 or 2 small actions that may get you a bonus book of your choice, For the most part, when you're trying to get books, you're going to be buying them from the other players and buying them off their player boards and spending money based on what they've said is the cost for those books, and maybe getting some victory points when you do. But it is a tight game. It is tight with money, it is tight with books, and both of those resources you need to do kind of the two big things of the game. Now there's also a research track that you'll be going up, and there's ways to kind of advance along there. There's a space, a worker placement space, where you can advance along that track, or you can get some extra dictionaries and a specific book of your choice. So that's kind of the one way to get extra books besides buying them from other players. There's also a spot that'll give you a lot of money, more money if you use more workers. And that is a tricky little spot because there are a lot of times that you're going to need a lot of money, but you may be wary about going there and spending most of your workers for a round just to get money. However, it's often the right play. It's just, there's kind of like a mental disconnect, I think, in not wanting to commit so many workers to get money. And then there's a spot you'll be using more towards the end of the game that you can go to convert money to points. Just a pure conversion. I think it's like a 7 to 10 or something. So you may go to that near the end of the game if you have a lot of extra money to convert some of that money to points in a way that you won't be able to do during endgame scoring. But there are a limited number of locations. Most of the locations you're trying to get professors or students, and then there are a few other locations that kind of help you tweak your gameplay by getting you some extra things like money or dictionaries and things like that, and buying books from other players. So I find the overall kind of gameplay and the mechanisms in this really chunky and fun, but I do think it's going to shine at 4 players, and I'm kind of looking to see what I think of it when I eventually do play it at 4. However, it's a game that I think for now, I do want to keep in my collection, and I plan on keeping in my collection for a while. It's a really, really solid game, and it's the kind of Euro that I like. So Alma Mater, let's call it for now like an 8.0, and that score may go up or down depending what I think of the game at 4 players. I also played Brew, and I've played this one before. I've talked about it in past videos. So if you want to see more about that, it's probably better to go look at what I've said in some other videos. I'm going to try repeating myself less and less. So if I've played a game that I've talked about before, I'm probably going to talk about it less and just refer people to the first video. So that way it'll keep the videos shorter and it'll allow people to go to one place just to hear my thoughts. But I will say that Brew is a dice placement game. It's a medium light game, plays over 4 rounds. Players are drafting potions, they're training animals, and they're using dice placement for area control to collect forest cards that will score them points. Also, once they've gotten some of these forest cards, they can retire some of their animals into the forests that match, that have the same color, and that will give them a few extra bonus points. It'll give them 3 instead of 1 for that animal. Potions are worth a variable amount, and I think that's where most people slip up when they're playing Brew. They tend to go for the forests and sometimes the animals, but you're going to spend the entire round bidding over maybe 1 or 2 forests that you end up getting. But you can get a potion every turn if you're generating enough resources. And the potions are, I think, between 2 and maybe 5 points. So I have noticed in my games, I have made a point of not neglecting the potions, and I found that I might be scoring 30, 40, 50 points in potions. So I think that's probably a place that some players misstep and they neglect the potions. But you definitely want to be getting as many potions as possible, and a potion every turn whenever you can. I like Brew a lot. It has really cutesy art, but it is very contentious, and if you're playing it well, there can be a lot of take that in the game. So for me, it's kind of a fun, quick, breezy game that you can get played in maybe a half an hour to an hour, but you need to also be playing with people who aren't going to be upset by the take that in the game. So I think for me, my score on this one right now is probably around a 7, and I think it's probably safe to say that that's where it's going to end up standing. But I do like Brew. It's just, at the end of the day, probably a little bit light for my taste, However, I do think there are really good choices. And if you're a fan of dice placement games or games with dice mitigation, if you like area control, and if kind of medium light games are your sweet spot, then this one would come with a high recommend. There's a lot going on to recommend this one. I also played In Too Deep, which is the latest Kickstarter that delivered from Burnt Island Games. They're the ones that picked up Endeavor with the new reprint and Age of Expansion. They also did In the Hall of the Mountain King, and most recently they did Fall of the Mountain King. And the same company under a different name, Kids Table Board Games, or Kids Table BG, is also responsible for another line of games that includes things like Fossilis and Power Plants and Creature Comforts. And Fossilis is a fantastic game. That is a Kickstarter that I backed. I've played it, and right now it's in my top 10, I think, for 2020. That's the year that it came out. But anyway, I finally received In Too Deep. This is a very unique game. I remember the first time they ran a Kickstarter for it, it didn't do very well, and I think part of that is it was kind of hard to understand the gameplay. It's a little bit unique and different from other games. So when you're playing In Too Deep, you're going to set up sort of a rondel of, I think it's 8 tiles, 8 triangle tiles. You're going to have a bunch of criminals that get placed out on these tiles. And then each player plays sort of a psychic agent who's operating outside the knowledge of the police to push criminals to complete certain crimes. So each turn, you're going to be hooking into at least one mind of a criminal and then influencing their behavior to do certain actions and complete certain crimes. And as players complete crimes, they're going to be earning rewards, things like intel, evidence, dilemma cards, and then the ability to put evidence into kind of this endgame scoring area. There's various actions that players can take on their turns. So this is a game that uses action points. And players are going to be doing things like moving around the board, triggering a power in the zone that they're in, which allows them to do different things, and generally kind of manipulating the board state so that it is the way that it needs to be to complete certain crime. So there are several different crimes in the game. They're labeled A through G. And depending on the player count, you're going to be using some or all of those crimes. There are also crimes of different levels. So for instance, if you would like to play an A2 crime, there needs to have first been completed an A1 crime by some player. So it kind of stacks as you go, and the rewards get better and better. There are also side mission crimes that you can do on your own quickly. They're just independent, and they require maybe less things done to complete them, but the rewards also aren't as great. So the larger idea here is that as players play the game, they're going to accumulate certain evidence. They can turn that evidence in during a round to get intel, which will score them bonus points at the end of the round. And if not all of the intel was collected by the various players, there may be penalties at the end of the round as well. Players are also using the evidence to put into certain areas that will give them bonus abilities and to create kind of hidden set collections for the end of the game. Now, at the end of the game, if there are at least 3 evidence tokens of at least 3 different types, then the mission has been successfully completed, which means one player, the player who went in too deep and drew too many dilemma cards, which give you abilities and endgame scoring bonuses and things like that. The player that has too many points from those cards is going to suffer an enormous amount of penalty points. So if you're going through the game and you're getting a lot of these dilemma cards to give yourself more and more endgame scoring abilities, then you want this kind of 3 evidence of at least 3 different types. You want that to fail. If you haven't collected a lot of those dilemma cards and you haven't given yourself a lot of these endgame bonus scoring methods, then you want the endgame mission to succeed. You want at least 3 evidence of 3 different types there, because that means another player is going to be the player who went in too deep. And that's because they kind of have gone into too many people's minds and descended too much into like the criminal mindset. and you want that other player to be penalized. But there are a lot of really good choices in this game, and the game plays differently and offers you different kinds of choices, really than any other game that I've seen before, which is why it was so attractive to me. I thought it would be a great addition to my collection. Now, I've played it at 2. I'd like to play it with more. There's also a solo game in there, and I'm really excited to try out the solo game. I think there are a few less criminals around the board, and there's at least one AI opponent that you're going to be playing against. But based on what I've seen of this game and the way it's kind of very thematic and the kind of different criminal missions you're trying to achieve, I think the solo game is going to be strong. So for me, because of the uniqueness of this game, this is probably sitting in the 8.0 range right now. It could go up a little bit, could go down a little bit. It'll just depend how I feel about it after future plays. But right now, I'm really loving this game, and I think it offers things that no other game really does. So I really encourage anyone, when this either hits retail or if you see people with it, game meetups and things like that, give it a try. It's a unique game that I think has a lot going for it. I also played Role Player Adventures, and I've played this one 3 times now. And this takes the kind of gameplay in Role Player where you're rolling dice and you're using various abilities to mitigate those dice and kind of move them around and change them. You're using it in a cooperative setting where you're basically doing like a Dungeons and Dragons game together, but everything that you do in the game is kind of resolved by these kinds of dice placement puzzles. And there are really 2 kinds in Role Player Adventures. There are combat, where you're going to be working together to defeat a monster, and then there are skill checks, where you need to, roll your dice and mitigate them and use cards and things to pass a skill check. And so far, I really do like the story that's going on here. It's a scripted story. It's a scripted campaign. And it plays out over 10 adventures and a finale and I think 1 side quest. So there's essentially 12 different adventures. If you're also using the expansion, which is Nephra's Judgment, that's not more adventures. So if you get this game and you're thinking you're going to play it through the base game, and then later you'll do the expansion, and you're thinking that's going to have maybe like a smaller storyline, it's not how the expansion works. The expansion you want to use with the base game. And it basically plays off of character alignment. So if you're playing with 3 or 4 players, each character is going to have kind of one little mini mission that's just for them that follows their alignment type. And you will get 4 different locations throughout the 12 adventure campaign. And when you're playing through a certain adventure and you're in a certain location, you'll be able to go somewhere and make usually a decision that will have some impact on your character. Now, if you're playing a 1 to 2 player game, and my fiance and I are playing a 2-player game, then they allow you to sort of double up on alignments, and so you get to do 2 side quests. But again, this is Nephra's Judgment. It's the expansion, and it's something that you're going to want to put into effect immediately when you play the base game, and then you'll be using it simultaneously along with the base game. And it'll give you these little kind of extra adventures and allow you to evolve your character a little bit and do something in addition to the main base game, something that's really only you. So when you encounter these little mini adventures, only you will be making the decision about how you resolve them, unlike in the main part of the game where players are kind of discussing and needing to come to agreement in how they're going to resolve certain things. So I have noticed that in general, there are sort of 2 kinds of dungeon crawl games. There's one that is heavily scripted, and if you replay it, you're essentially going to be playing the same adventure. There are other games that are heavily randomized, where every time you play it, it's going to be very different. Those games tend to build themselves more around tactics and mechanics and less around story, because the story is going to be very thin and very variable. Now, this year, Sleeping Gods right now is my #1 game of the year so far, and that is a scripted storybook game much like this one. The difference with Sleeping Gods, however, is that world is so big that when you go through and play a campaign, you're not going to be able to see everything in the world. You're going to have to make certain choices, you'll explore certain parts of the world, and you'll go on certain adventures. And at some point, the adventure will end. And much like maybe a video game, if you want to achieve everything that Sleeping Gods has to offer, you need to go on multiple campaigns. And so other campaigns will take you to other areas. Maybe you'll pursue other stories. And over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 campaigns, you'll eventually see everything. You'll eventually resolve all of the story points, and you'll eventually achieve all of the achievements in the game, much like a video game that you have to play through the campaign multiple times to unlock everything and get all of the achievements. And I think that's the genius of Sleeping Gods, that it is so open and so big that it really demands that you play the campaign multiple times, and every time you do, it's going to be very different. You're going to see things and interact with things that you won't have even come near in previous plays. Another game that I like a lot that came out this year was Dice Throne Adventures, and that takes the exact opposite tactic. It imports characters from Dice Throne, and it allows you to use them cooperatively in a dungeon crawl. But in that game, there really is no story. There's a heavy amount of randomization and customization. So when you do this dungeon crawl, you're going to be bringing in different characters every time, presumably. And there's going to be different monsters that you fight, different kind of smaller bosses, different larger bosses, and then you kind of have these big mega bosses in between every couple of rounds. So there is high variability in that one. There's also unlockables, so the more that you play it, the more you're going to put more stuff in the game, and it'll change up the game. And that is a game, also like Alter Quest, that I played fairly recently, that has almost unlimited replayability because of the way it throws variability into the game and allows you to mix and match things and make every experience different. So Role Player Adventures is the former type. It is a scripted game, and the game tries to give you choices to make. So as you go through and play the game, you will reach different story points where you're going to have to make a decision that may increase or lower certain faction tracks. It may determine certain weapons that you get, whether you succeed in certain missions. You may be fighting different monsters a little bit based on your choices. But here's the thing, at the end of the day with Role Player Adventures, as far as I can tell from being 3 games in, which is about 25% of the way through, these choices are really only ever going to amount to different window dressing. So if you go and you bring different characters in and you play through it again, you're essentially going to be doing the same thing. You're going to be playing the same adventure. You may make different choices here and there. They may subtly change certain things in the game, but in general, you will be playing the same adventure. You will be interacting with these same events. You may make different choices, and that may slightly change what happens, but it's minimal. Now, keeping in mind with all of that, this is an enormous box. It is very heavy because there's essentially like 12 different Dungeons and Dragons type modules in the game. It's just a lot of game. And when I backed it with the expansion, and then when you throw in shipping, I think it was about $152 for the game when all is said and done. So I guess the question here is $152 worth spending on a game that will essentially give you 12 play sessions. And, maybe you put the game away for a couple of years, you come back to it when it's no longer fresh in your mind. Maybe you'll be able to play through it once more using different characters and making different choices, and it'll seem fresh enough because it will have faded from your memory. But maybe not. Maybe you play it through once, the 12 adventures, and then you decide, I've pretty much gotten what I can out of this game, and you sell it. Is $152 worth 12 adventures? I don't know. I think for me, I'm enjoying it, and I think it's well written, and I think that the adventure is well designed and the mechanics are kind of clever in how they work. But my question here is there enough game to merit that cost and the size of the box and the weight of the box for kind of a one-time, for the most part, gaming experience? I'm not sure, but I think for $152, I'd probably lean towards no. So I am enjoying the game, and I'm looking forward to finishing the adventure and, seeing how I feel about it once I've seen everything. But for me right now, Role Player Adventures is sitting in and around a 7 to 8. The other thing to think about at the same time is that gameplay wise, I mean, there's a lot of cards that you're using, and you're using those cards for dice mitigation. But really, at the end of the day, you're just doing two things. You're doing dice place mitigation in puzzles where you're trying to kill people, and you're using dice placement mitigation in puzzles where you're trying to do a skill check. So the mechanics are very samey. And even though you're getting this pretty compelling narrative campaign, the mechanics are kind of thin. They're well presented. I like the game tray system. It's really good. It looks sharp. It's easy to tear down and set back up, which I think is another thing in these games that's really important. And in Sleeping Gods, as good as Sleeping Gods is, their tear down and save system and set back up system is horrid. It barely exists. It's basically throw everything in plastic bags. So as good as that game is, it's something that when you're playing it, you're going to want to try to leave it up on a table indefinitely while you play it. It's a big pain to tear down Sleeping Gods and then bring it back out. That's not a problem with role-player adventures. I just think that the life of role-player adventures is much more condensed and much more linear, and in that sense, kind of just a shorter experience overall. So yeah, I'm sitting around probably a 7.5 on this one. It may go up to an 8 if the adventure is amazing and pays off really well, but that's not going to change the fact that this is a limited linear adventure that, even though they've put as much variability as they can, that variability, as far as I can tell so far, really just seems to result in reskinning certain things, kind of window dressing changes, but the meat of the campaign can't really change that much because it is a scripted campaign. I also played Wildlands, which is designed by, I almost sounded like Christopher Walken, which is designed by Martin Wallace, who has designed Age of Steam, Railways of the World, the Brass games, Australia. He's one of my favorite designers. But this is a unique, weird kind of thing for Martin to have designed because it is a miniatures fighting game and it is light. Essentially, you're going to be using cards to move miniatures around the board and pick up shards and kill the other player's miniatures. You need 5 points to win a game. You get a point every time you pick up a shard, and you start the game with 5 shards on the board. So if you were able to pick up every shard, you would win the game. So you technically could win the game without interacting in combat or attacking other players' miniatures. But for every miniature you kill, you also get a point. So there may be shards in the game, depending on how they're situated and where your characters are. There may be shards that are really difficult to get to, which means you may end up having to kill 1 or 2 members of the other player's party to get your 5 points. It may be too hard to do it all through picking up shards. But I really like the game, and I'm a heavier gamer, and this is a simple game, but I like the kind of balance between the different kinds of card play. Now, I've played this twice with different people, and neither one of them have liked the game. My fiance actually just walked away from the game because she really does not like take-that games, and this is literally a direct confrontation game. So trying to play it gave her such anxiety that she just couldn't continue playing it. My other friend he plays a lot of heavy games, but for some reason the mechanics in this game just kept eluding his brain, and he kept kind of doing things incorrectly. And I think he was just frustrated with the game. I think he wanted a more complicated game that had more going on, and I think the mechanics that were in the game, for whatever reason, just kind of jumbled in his brain. So I really liked Wildlands, but so far I'm 0 for 2 with the people that I've played with liking it. Now, I also have both of the additional map packs, I have both of the add-on factions, and I have a big expansion that allows you to play the game in teams with up to 6 players, and a cooperative mode that you can play solo, and I'm not sure how many players you can do it with, maybe up to 4. I'm really looking forward to trying that cooperative mode with my fiance and seeing if she likes that any better. But I am now in a position where I have this game that I like, that is kind of a medium light miniature skirmish game that uses cards to do various things that I enjoy, that so far nobody that I know enjoys. And I've got, the base game, 2 map packs, 2 faction expansions, and a big expansion. So my question is, do I keep this or when do I reach a point where I say I'm just going to sell the whole package? And I'm probably going to need to play it with a few more friends and see how they like it. But if it's something that nobody that I know likes, it's going to make me influenced, I think, more towards selling it. Although right now I don't want to sell it because I enjoy it. And I think it's a really good game that, depending on the person, I could pull out and teach to somebody in 10 minutes. And we could play, and it's this fun kind of miniature skirmish game that doesn't really last too long. You could get it played in maybe a half an hour, depending on choices that people make. And I think if people aren't belaboring their choices, it really shouldn't take more than, say, an hour. So it's a lighter game. It's fun and breezy. It's relatively quick. And I don't know. For me, it's just, there's something about it that's very, very fun. I just need to find people who share that opinion. So my rating for Wildlands right now is probably about a 7.5. I do agree with my friend Ethan that I think for me to like it even more, I might need more going on in the game. And I tend to favor those kinds of games. So for it to get a higher score, it probably would need more going on. But I do enjoy it for what it is. And I think if you like games in this kind of complexity level that do this kind of thing, your score may be a point or two higher than mine. And maybe something that you really, really like. So keep that in mind. So it's like a 7.5 for me right now. But I think for people who like this kind of game, their score is only going to be higher. I also played Unmatched. And this is a game that I've played before. Unmatched is also a miniature skirmish game, but instead of playing with factions, you're playing kind of one-on-one. You can also play it in teams. If you have 4 players, you can do a 2-on-2 team game. But I have a few different versions of this game. I have Cobble and Fog, which comes with 4 characters, Dracula, the Invisible Man, Jekyll and Hyde, and Sherlock, who comes with Watson. I also have Battle of Legends Volume 1 that has characters like Medusa and Sinbad, and I forget the other 2 that are in that pack. I have 2 packs that are 2 characters each, and the cool thing about that, if you're looking to try out this system, because it is a system that has kind of so many characters and things, even if you buy a 2-player version of the game, a 2-player pack, there is a map in there. Those maps are double-sided as well as the 4 character packs, but the maps for the 2 character packs are the same on both sides. They're just designed a little bit differently. So if you play on one side, the iconography of the circle spaces is much clearer, but it's a little bit more, I guess, gameplay breaking. Whereas if you go to the other side, it kind of blends in more with the artwork and it makes the board look a lot nicer. But it's a little less evident what's happening iconographically. So just something to be aware of. If you buy a 4-player version, Cobble and Fog, Battle of Legends Volume 1 or Battle of Legends Volume 2, then you're going to have a board that is double-sided, and each map on each side is a different map. But I think it's really cool that even in a 2-player set, you're going to be getting a map. So I do have 2 of the 2-character sets. I have Little Red Riding Hood with Beowulf, and I have Robin Hood with Bigfoot. Then I have a 1-character set. So they've made 2 different 1-character sets. And these are the only sets that don't come with boards. So this is just, if you want this character, you can buy them. So I got Bruce Lee, because he's Bruce Lee. And there's also a 1-character set for Deadpool, which I think I'll probably pick up at some point, because Deadpool is really, really cool as well. I like this game a lot. I like the system a lot. It's, again, something I think that you can show to somebody and teach them in 5 or 10 minutes, and then it plays relatively quickly. And it uses deck building. You're going to be using these cards for various effects. You're going to be using them to move around the board, to play schemes, which are kind of like instant abilities, or to attack the other character. Or if you're getting attacked, you can play a card to defend yourself. And that's basically the game. So it plays quickly, it's easy to teach, it's a lot of fun, I think. And each character has different kinds of decks and different mechanics in them. And they really, really do work differently for every character and give you a feeling of a different combat style. That's really where the game excels, in my opinion. It's also designed by some of the same designers who did War Chest and the Undaunted series. So it's just a really good collection of games, and I think all three of those games are just so well designed and provide for really good kind of strategic chess-like moves. So I'm a huge fan of Unmatched. I think I have this one sitting around maybe an 8.0. It probably would be higher if I liked lighter games more. So if you like miniature skirmish games and you like kind of medium light games, you're probably going to rate this one higher than I did. Probably higher than an 8. But there are a lot of really good games in the section that I played this past week. And we've now concluded that section, so I'm going to go forward and talk to you about the one currently running Kickstarter that I think is something you might want to take a look at this period. So that game is Shikoku 1889, and they started with a minimum required funding goal of $25,000. They're currently sitting at $189,000, which is about 6.75 times that minimum required funding goal. Now they're going to conclude this campaign on Saturday, January 1st. Shikoku 1889 is a game for 2 to 6 players. It's going to play in about 3.5 hours, so it is a longer game. The complexity on this is heavy, and we're going to set the risk here for this campaign on high. Now, the reason for that is that the publisher has only run one Kickstarter before. It's been delivered. It seems like the response on it is pretty good, but it was one game. I don't feel confident yet sort of graduating them to a medium-high risk. So they're staying at high, at least until they deliver one more Kickstarter successfully. Now, this game is an 18xx game, and if you're wondering what that is, it is sort of a subgenre of game that is themed around trains and stock market manipulation and tile placement. So it usually has players building train tracks and trading stocks in various train companies. And the 18xx refers to different years. So there are a lot of games in this genre that are produced by different publishers, and they tend to all label themselves by some year in the 1800s. Now, Shikoku 1889 has had a title change with this reprinting, because that's what it is. It is a reprinting. It was originally called 1889 History of Shikoku Railways, and it's a fairly well-known game in the 18xx series. It's also a really good entry point into the series, and it's a little bit different from some of the other games because it's set in Japan, and a lot of these games are set more in the West. Now, Shikoku is designed by Yatsutaka Ikeda, and he designed the original version of this game, the one that's called 1889 History of Shikoku Railways. He's also designed a game called Owner's Choice, and a game that's more of a kind of social deduction party game called Shadowhunters, which is a game that I actually really like. The artist on this new version of the game is Karim Shakrun. He's previously worked on Alien Frontiers, Hammer of the Scots, and Julius Caesar, Caesar, Pompeii, and the Roman Civil War. And the game is being published by Grand Trunk Games. As I mentioned, they've only previously done one Kickstarter, but it was for 2 games combined. And so there are technically 3 Board Game Geek entries. There's one for each game and one for sort of the combined version. But those 2 games are 1861, The Railways of the Russian Empire, and 1867, Railways of Canada. And then, like I said, there is an additional entry in Board Game Geek that's like 1861/1867, and then it lists both titles kind of combined. Now, there's only one pledge level for this campaign. It is $50. It's called Shikoku 1889, and if you want the game, that's the price that you're going to pledge. I usually don't talk about shipping too much. I usually throw out just one number, and it's the number for the continental US. In this case, since there's only one pledge, it's $20. So if you pledge this, if you're in the continental US, the total is going to be $70, 50 for the pledge, 20 for shipping. If you're located somewhere else, you just need to look and see what the shipping is for wherever you live. And finally, Grand Trunk Games is aiming to deliver Shikoku 1889 in September of 2022. So I haven't actually backed any games this period. I only highlighted one game last video, and that was for the Borderlands miniatures game. I had originally backed that game because I didn't want to lose the early bird bonus, but I was never fully on board with that campaign. So I was kind of waffling back and forth. It had a very, very high price tag, and I just decided at the end of the day that I didn't need another huge miniatures game with all of this add-on stuff. I want to be very kind of specific and make a very considered choice when I add another big game like that. So I ended up canceling my pledge for Borderlands, and I had no back games this period. I did, however, have 3 acquired games. The first of those games is Arkwright, the card game. Now, I'd heard great things about Arkwright in the past, the board game, but the board game is out of print. It's really hard to find. And at the time that I was learning about Arkwright and how hard it is to track down, they did a Kickstarter for a card game version. And that card game version looked actually pretty good. I think I probably still want to try to get the board game at some point, but it seems like that's becoming kind of a grail game situation where it's going to be hard to find, especially if I want to find a new copy or a near new copy. So for now, at least, I'm contenting myself with the card game. I haven't played it yet, so I don't know how it plays, but I'm hoping to get it to the table sometime in the month of January. I also got the Defence of Procyon III, which is a new game by David Turksey. It's being published by PSC Games, which is the same company that published his game Roman Roll. And I like David Turksey a lot. I think he's becoming one of my favorite designers. My favorite designers are Vital Lacerda, and David's even done the solo mode in a couple of Vital's recent games. Now, the Defence of Procyon is a really unique game. It is a up to 4-player game, but it's split up by teams. So if you play it with 2 players, then 1 player will be controlling the alien faction, and there's kind of 2 sides to the alien faction. There is a side in space and a side on a planet, and the planet they're trying to invade. There's also a human side. So there's humans in space trying to defend themselves against these invading aliens, and there's the planet side area with the humans, where they're defending this kind of alien takeover. So if you play with 2 players, 1 player is playing the aliens and the other player is playing the humans. However, because this is a very asymmetric Euro that is also kind of a miniatures war game, if you play with 4 players, then you're going to have 2 teams. And one side of that team will be playing that faction space side, and the other side will be playing that faction planet side. I find it fascinating. It's almost like they took, Star Wars Rebellion and they made it for 4 players with kind of more Euro elements, and they put these teams together. It also reminds me of a Mind Clash game called Cerebria. That's a very heavy Euro, but that's a game that you also play in teams, and each player is doing something very different, very kind of asymmetric to what they're doing. So this just hits a lot of buttons for me in different ways, and it's so unique. The fact that it's a miniatures war game, it's a pretty heavy Euro game, it is an asymmetric game, and it has kind of all of these variable player powers, and you can also play in teams. This is just kind of the sort of game that I'm looking more and more to add to my collection because it does something very different from other games. So I'm very excited to get this one played, and definitely that will happen in January. Now, the last game on my acquired games list is a game called Townsfolk Tussle. Now, this one is being published by a first-time publisher. It was also their first Kickstarter, called Panic Roll. That's the name of the company. And they're essentially doing a boss battler, maybe in the vein of something like Kingdom Death, but it is lighter, it is less complicated, it is easier, and it's using kind of 1920s, 1930s style animation. So think like early Disney, or if you're a video gamer, it's the same kind of animation style they applied to Cuphead, which is a video game that's within the last couple of years, it's done pretty well. It has this very kind of unique art style. So that all made me very interested in Townsfolk Tussle. It was definitely kickstarted with the idea that this is a shorter, simpler kind of boss battler, and something that, because of the art style and the cheeky sense of humor, may appeal to non-gamers as well as gamers. And theoretically, there's kind of an easier mechanical system here so that it can be picked up and played fairly quickly. Now, I do have a friend who's played this with a mutual board game designer friend of ours, and both of them really disliked this game. They thought it did not compare and not stand alongside Kingdom Monster, although I don't think that it needs to. And they just had problems with the gameplay to the point that I think they both thought it was borderline broken. Now, I don't know that that's true. It's certainly something that I want to look into and get to the table quickly to find out if I agree with them or not. But my friends can be very opinionated sometimes, so I'm not necessarily assuming that his opinion or their opinion is an opinion that I will also hold. So I don't want to make anyone nervous in me saying that. I just, in my kind of frame of reference, there are people out there who didn't love the game. So I can't kind of communicate unabashed joy and anticipation because there are these naysaying voices out there. But I will be playing it soon. I will be playing it in January, and I will let you know what I think and whether this is something that as it hits retail, you may want to consider getting, or I may throw my voice onto the pile with theirs and say, yeah, maybe wait for the next one. But I will let you know what I think, and I really do want to get it played soon. Now, before I wrap things up, I do want to do a quick what's coming section. Because we're at the holidays here, things are changing, we're going into a new year. I do plan on getting out my November and December Game of the Month videos probably in the next 2 weeks, and one will follow the other. That's kind of been pushed to the side while I've been doing other things, but I do plan on getting those out soon, and then I'll be sort of caught up. And then once I hit the first week of February, I will publish my January 2022 Game of the Month video. I also plan on continuing these Kickstarter weeklies. The one for next week may be a little bit late. However, it will be less late than this week, but because of New Year's Eve, I may be getting it out more around like Sunday instead of Friday when it's supposed to come out. But after that one, moving forward, they should be coming out on Friday very consistently for 2022. So those two types of videos will continue to be published, and even in a more timely manner than they have in the past. In addition to that, I have several projects that I'm going to be working on over the next year and a half. So the first project is a video series that will profile my most anticipated games of 2022. And this is going to be a video series that you will see launching probably the day after this video hits. So the first video in that series will be my top 10 runners-up of games I'm most excited about that will hopefully publish in 2022. Then I'm going to kind of zag sideways and publish probably 2 videos, but this is going to depend somewhat on my runners-up video. We'll see how long a video of me focusing on 10 games runs. If it's less than a half an hour, then the future videos in that series will likely focus on 20 games each, which means I will have 7 more videos in the series. The next 2 will focus on expansions and newer versions of games, kind of like reprintings or later editions. So I'll have 40 games to talk about of that type. I just don't want to include those kind of new additions or expansions in with the main list. And then I will go to my top 100 most anticipated games. And the way I think I'm going to handle those is to just do them in alphabetical order, because I don't think it really makes sense for me to kind of, rank them one by one, especially when we're looking at games that I haven't even played. They're not out yet. And I think even more importantly, it's going to be better for you guys, the consumers, to get the list alphabetically and just be able to look through it and see everything that's there. I think it's going to be the most useful for you if I present it that way. So that's the first video series project. And I'm going to be working on that over the next couple weeks. As I do, I will continue to get out the Kickstarter weekly videos, and probably when that ends, or maybe kind of as it's ending, I'll be getting out those Game of the Month videos. The next project will probably hit in March. and that will be my top 30 games of 2020. That will be followed around June, so we're kind of doing things every 3 months, every quarter. In June, I will do my top 300 games of all time. Also at that time, I will probably be launching a Patreon. And when I do that series of videos, the last 50 of those games, my friend Ryan's going to join me and he will present his top 50 games as well. So we'll have a little feedback and kind of interplay on the top 50 of my top 300. Once we go into September, I will then be doing my top 30 games probably of 2021. I think by then I should have had enough time to play through everything from this last year. I'll be caught up. I can do that series then. Then when we get to December, when we kind of complete the year, I will then do my, top 100 anticipated games of 2023, which then will put us on track. So when I hit March of 2023, I will then be doing my top 30 games of 2022, the year that just completed, which right now is the year that's coming up. And then in the future, it should be consistent. You'll probably see my anticipated games list come out every December, and then my top games of the year come out in March. Now, what that means is that while I'm doing these series of videos, especially the first one, all of my other videos that don't include the Kickstarter Weekly and the Game of the Month videos, those are going to be put on hiatus. And I'll pick those back up when I conclude that video series in about 2 weeks' time. So I have a bunch of first impressions videos I've been wanting to complete that I've kind of had to keep postponing for various reasons. Some the holidays, some personal reasons, boosters, all these other things. I don't think I'm going to go back to those games because I think it's just too much backlog and I don't want to go into the new year trying to play catch up. So I think how I'm going to approach this is that when I start doing the first impressions videos again in about 2 weeks, I'm just going to start with new just delivered games. So the first impressions videos will probably come out maybe 1 or 2 a week, and they will be for games that either had their Kickstarters just arrive or games that just hit retail that I picked up. And then any games that I want to do videos on that are kind of older, including some of these, games that I have first impressions videos I wanted to do outstanding. If I want to do videos on those games, they will come in the form of a full teach and review. And then as I mentioned, we'll hit June, the Patreon will launch, and as I kind of get into a groove with all these videos, somewhere after that, maybe around September, I'm going to be launching a Twitch channel, and then you'll be able to see me and some of my friends and my fiance play various types of games on Twitch online. Some of them will be campaign games, some of them will be, Euros, kind of one-offs. Some of them may be solo games, but I'm going to be doing different kinds of games on different nights. And I'll come up with some kind of schedule oriented around different types of games and genres, and then I'll be multitasking that with the video production work. So that is kind of what's happening this coming year in a nutshell. And I'm really excited for this 2020 anticipated game list. I haven't seen too many people doing it the way that I want to do it, and I think it's going to be a very good tool that you guys can use to keep track of what you might want to look at, that's coming out in 2022. And it'll save you the work of having to go through Board Game Geek and do like a search and kind of edit everything down. Like I've already done that for you. And I'll be presenting to you my 100 most anticipated games with 10 honorable mentions. So I'm looking at those additional 10 games not as kind of like failures that didn't make the list, but I'm looking at those games as games that maybe on a different day, under different circumstances, they may have made the list instead of a few of those games that, are in the 90 to 100 range. So I'm looking at more as just giving you some bonus games, covering all bases, and making sure maybe a few stragglers are still able to be named and be mentioned, and be games that you can check and see if they're things that you like. So be looking for that series. It's going to launch probably the day after this is posted, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please don't forget to like the video. And if you'd like to see more content like this in the future and you're excited for some of my plans in the next year, don't forget to subscribe. Once you're subscribed, you can even hit the alarm bell if you want to be notified every time I publish a future video. Have a great holiday weekend. Have a great New Year's. Play lots of great games. Try to find the right person to kiss when that ball drops. And I will see you very soon in my next series of videos. Take care.